Obviously, we have a shortened week here. I hope everybody had a relatively decent break, probably much needed for all of us. We did have to kind of change the schedule around a little bit. So what was supposed to be Monday's reading, we're just kind of smushing it into today's reading. The other one that was for today, relatively short, but they kind of complement each other. Also a short Plato passage. It's an interesting passage because I'll be coming back to it a few times, I think, for the rest of the semester. Then there's the course pack reading. There's another reading comprehension that opens at noon. Just one thing to mention about the midterm grade element. I do have the grades. Basically, what I have to do is I download them into my own grade spreadsheet, and that has the curve formula. But there's two elements to the curve formula. I wouldn't even really call it a curve. It's more of a grade enhancement formula. But I haven't done the second part of the of that calculation. And basically, what it is if you answered a question on the exam, you automatically get a half point. This is what I've usually done in other classes when we do the, the bubble exams. So I have to figure all that stuff in and then apply the quote unquote curve. So I'm going to do that this afternoon if I can, figure it out. Not a math person, but we'll figure it out. Any other questions or anything before we start?
Any administrative questions at all?
All right. So today we're basically going to be talking about we're going to continue on with some of the issues that we've been talking about the so-called self, or how we conduct ourselves or behave online and what effects that might have on us. Facebook has obviously been in the news a lot lately for pretty bad reasons. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of that, and we're going to bring in Plato. I do have a few tweets here. I think these are from actually a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic hit. And I just want to, they're still kind of relevant, obviously, because of stuff that we're learning. So I just want to kind of read some of these. So Alex Winter, he was in, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. He says, artists who attempt to identify as brands face a self-negating, unattainable aim. Artists aren't corporations, but people, unless you're Mitt Romney, right? Or the law. Messy and self-contradictory, not in a constant state of productivity or expansion. Best to ignore those who tell you to manage your brand. You aren't one. And that's an interesting statement from this artist, this actor, because the push in the last several years or so with things like Instagram and YouTube is to talk about yourself as a brand. And social media seems to be pushing that kind of idea. But this gets back to the idea of appearances and reality. What version of self are you? Do you most identify with? Is it the one that you're creating online? Is there some separate one in real life? That sort of thing. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, just kind of continuing on. A couple of more interesting tweets. John Hodgman, he's a comedian, says, I've been on Twitter since 2008, met a lot of nice people and got to peer into the brains of a lot of monsters, right? People refer to Twitter as the hell site sometimes. I'm not quitting, but I'm ashamed it's taken me a decade plus to appreciate that it is now, and perhaps mostly always was, a shit pot. Some come to stir it, others to get stirred. Believe me, as an in real life conflict averse person who basically would prefer to stay home these days, again, this is before the pandemic. It pains me to say the answer is in the real world. Activism, volunteering, calling reps, canvassing, voter registration, talking to neighbors, Go TV, voting, that sort of thing, right? So Hodgman here is also kind of invoking this idea of a real world, you can easily distinguish from this online social media world. And one of the issues that we've been kind of talking about is where exactly does that distinction, where is that line? So he's invoking this kind of Platonic issue that we've been, kind of, it's sort of been in the background, especially with Turkle. And it's going to, basically continue to be there. It's going to be there with 1984 as well. So he continues, activism and debate on Twitter is basically just slamming the airplane seat in front of you over and over and over again, right? So even you've probably heard some people say things like, why won't you debate me, or demands for debating people on Twitter even. Well, if you've ever noticed, that doesn't really work so well, because as Hodgman is saying here, it's basically just beating or flogging a dead horse. It's just, it's just back and forth noise. It's not actual, productive discussion. If you've ever gone into the comments section on Facebook or on your local news media site, it's the same kind of thing. So right now, anyway, and again, this was from a couple of years ago or so, year and a half ago before the pandemic, online debate and online participation, it's not exactly an ideal place to be conducting or political discourse, but that is in fact where a lot of it is taking place. So one question is, can it be made better? And of course, how exactly could it be made better, right? What would be sort of design mechanisms? What might be legal mechanisms to not only make social media experience better, but also to stop from making it getting worse? That's kind of been the issue in the last couple of years or so. So here's just a couple of headlines. I think these are from last fall, maybe last spring, actually. So these aren't that current, but again, they're current because this stuff hasn't been resolved. So Mark Zuckerberg changed the rules, how Facebook went easy on Alex Jones and other right-wing figures. Mark Zuckerberg personally intervened to soften Alex Jones's Facebook ban, a report claims. Zuckerberg feared Facebook's conservative users, so they received special treatment. Facebook, Google, and Twitter CEOs to appear at March misinformation hearing. These aren't unrelated, right? This misinformation element. And again, this is about a year ago or several months ago. Mark Zuckerberg has done nothing but sort of deny any responsibility for any of this. Part of his excuse or explanation is he wants to, put as much stuff out there as he can so people can, quote unquote, make up their own minds. But really what we're finding now in these so-called Facebook papers that just came out, what we're finding is that if you take away some of this stuff here, you're going to lose what Facebook calls engagement. And engagement is what drives the bottom line at Facebook. And so what he's really fearful about is losing this whole engagement element. So this is from, several months ago or whatever. Here's a couple of quotes from an article from, I believe, yesterday, right? So this is what this says, right? While the phrase the algorithm has taken on sinister, even mythical overtones, it is at its most basic level a system that decides a post's position on the newsfeed based on predictions about each user's preferences and tendencies. The details of its design determine what sorts of content thrive on the world's largest social network and what types languish, which in turn shapes the posts we all create and the ways we interact on its platform, right? So just to highlight a couple of issues here that are going to become relevant in a second. Well, they're relevant now, I guess, based on predictions about each user's preferences and tendencies. So Facebook reads your preferences, it reads your the tendencies that you have when engaging in online behavior, and it creates again a sort of version of you that shapes your newsfeed. It shapes literally the reality that you engage in within Facebook. right? So this in turn shapes the posts we all create and the ways we interact on its platform. So your preferences, which it basically gets from your behavior, right? Likes, engagement, comments, whatever, takes all of that and then interprets it and then shapes your news feed, which again sort of limits, in a sense, it's limited by the algorithm, the kind of engagement that you can engage in, right? Because Facebook is interpreting your previous engagement and then shaping your future engagement through the algorithm. Facebook doesn't release comprehensive data on the actual proportions of posts in any given user's feed or on Facebook as a whole. And each user's feed is highly personalized to their behaviors, right? But a combination of internal Facebook documents, publicly available information, and conversations with Facebook insiders offers a glimpse into how different approaches to the algorithm can dramatically alter the categories of content that tend to flourish. And what they've been finding, and this is kind of the news story of the last couple of days or so, is that hateful, divisive, and other types of content like that, that's really what drives engagement, right? It's a psychological reading that Facebook has actually gotten from all of this data that they've procured from, everybody on the site. And they do, in fact, engage in these psychological experiments. What they found is that hateful, divisive content is the one that drives engagement, and engagement is the most important thing for Facebook. So it's kind of this worst case scenario, I guess, for how you would want a social media site to operate. Again, as I've mentioned, Mark Zuckerberg didn't wake up at Harvard one day and say, how can I ruin democracy? But the technology and the way people are using it seem to sort of point in that direction, sort of having an impact on the political culture and just the way we conduct politics. So all of this is sort of a little bit of a preface to this short Plato passage, very short passage actually, and we're going to sort of concentrate on a couple of aspects of it. But one of the ideas behind what Plato is talking about in this passage is a sort of education, right? What is the good that the masses and these paid teachers, what he calls sophists, what is this good that they attempt to teach, right? So the sophists, you can think of them as teachers you would pay, basically a rich white male, a rich Greek Athenian male would pay to a teacher to teach them how to speak really eloquently, right? And what they're doing is saying that there's value in this, there's good in this, right? What they do, though, is they want you to believe that what you think is good for you is, in fact, good for you. And that's what they're going to teach you. They're going to teach you how to sort of articulate why your own personal beliefs, as it were, are the best. And they're going to do this for each person, no matter how inconsistent their own individual beliefs are. So these teachers, these sophists, what they do is they learn your own persuasions and essentially sell them back to you as good, right? Now, this is where the Platonic philosophical element comes in. There is no attempt by the sophists to figure out what really is good. They just want to teach you to be able to persuade other people's what is good, whether it really is or not. And the kicker here is the good is whatever you happen to like. So you can kind of take this idea and apply it to social media and advertising. And in fact, certain studies have shown by one of the authors, in fact, that I talked about last week, Vaidyanathan, Facebook follows a sort of advertising model when it designs the algorithm or designs how you interact with the news feed. But essentially what's going on is it's the same kind of thing, right? Facebook is using this kind of psychological, these kind of psychological tools that advertisers use, right? So in general, but especially with Facebook, they're following advertising's playbook here. Essentially, the idea with that is they're getting you to think that what you already believe is what's best for you, right? That's kind of what advertising is all about. And what's interesting is sometimes I show a video or a section of a video from this PBS documentary called The Persuaders, where they interview this, this king of advertising, and his major contribution to advertising was to find these sort of key words that advertisers can put into, their ad campaigns or whatever, that tap into what this guy calls the reptilian brain, right? It's tapping into our preferences, our desires that we may, that actually may be subconscious in some sense. But when you see them, when you're confronted with them in the advertisement, they hook you, right? Well, social media is kind of following these same kinds of techniques. So I want to just read this short passage from the Republic and kind of highlight what I think is interesting about it, because it's 2,500 years old, and he's kind of talking about the same sorts of things that's going on with social media techniques. All right, obviously you don't have to write this down because you've already got it. So he says, Socrates says, none of those private wage earners, the ones these people call sophists and consider to be their rivals in craft, teaches anything other than the convictions the masses hold when they are assembled together. And this he calls wisdom, right? So wisdom is the label that they're giving to whatever the masses think. It is just as if someone were learning the passions and appetites of a huge, strong beast that he is rearing, how to approach and handle it, when it is most difficult to deal with or most docile, and what makes it so, and what sounds it utters in either condition, and what tones of voice soothe or anger it. Having learned all this through associating and spending time with the beast, he calls this wisdom, gathers his information together as if it were a craft, and starts to teach it. Knowing nothing in reality about which of these convictions or appetites is fine or shameful, good or bad, just or unjust, he uses all these terms in conformity with the great beast's beliefs, calling the things it enjoys good and the things that anger it bad. He has no other account to give of them, but calls everything he is compelled to do just and fine, never having seen how much the natures of compulsion and goodness really differ, and being unable to explain it to anyone. Don't you think, by Zeus, that someone like this would make a strange educator, right? Not only is this a commentary, or can you at least sort of interpret social media through this kind of lens, but certain trends in education themselves can be understood through this lens as well. For example, you have to teach students the only things that they want to read, or something like that, right? Don't challenge them, just give them everything that they want. That's kind of what Plato's talking about here. Social media is doing the basically the same thing, right? So having learned all this through associating and spending time with the beast, he calls this wisdom, gathering this information as if it were a craft, and starts to teach it, right? Facebook is gathering your information. What's it doing with it? It's interpreting you essentially, and then narrowing the news feed. So it personalizes it as much as it can based on its interpretation. So it's this interesting element of compulsion versus goodness, right? You can think of, for example, when a parent is rearing a child, and the child won't stop crying, for example. And so what does the parent do? They might reach for some ice cream and, give the ice cream to the baby. Guess what? The crying stops. Well, isn't ice cream therefore good for the baby? You just keep doing that, and you just keep thinking in that way. What you're actually doing is harming the baby by giving it what it is compelled, or what it just happens to desire at that moment. not knowing, if we want to use Plato's language, what really is good for the baby. Probably if you fed the baby broccoli, it would continue to cry, right? So how does social media and advertising use this kind of compulsion against us? Well, again, essentially because what they're doing is telling us what we want to hear and then labeling this a good, right? Well, this person is clicking on all these things. It must be good for them, right? So one question here is, if social media and advertising use our convictions to get us to do and believe certain things through clicks and other forms of engagement, exactly how free are we in exploring and creating these identities through their technology? So one thing we've been talking about is the possibility that identity creation and exploration through social media technologies can be a positive thing. The question, though, is it really free, or are we freely engaging in this kind of activity if the technology itself is in some sense manipulating us? And Facebook, as we've continued to find out, is indeed manipulating us in pretty stark ways. Again, you don't have to write this down. You've already read it. Just recall, though, Plato's cave myth, right? At some point, Socrates says, and if there had been honors, praises, or prizes among them for the one who is sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by, and was best able to remember which usually came earlier, which later, and which simultaneously, and who was thus best able to prophesize the future. Do you think that our man would desire these rewards or envy those among the prisoners who were honored and held power, right? Think of like Instagram, or think of any sort of presentation element in social media where you're essentially awarded prizes, right, for doing ridiculous things, right? What's the one from last summer, the milk crate challenge or whatever? I mean, people are given likes or rewards, prizes, as it were, for these kinds of silly sorts of things. The Tide Pod challenge. All of these things are actually quite harmful in a sense. In what ways are they harmful? Well, obviously you can break bones, but perhaps they're harmful in deeper ways. So one question is, I mean, just going back to the cave story, are we like these prisoners? Of course, Socrates says this, right? Socrates says the prisoners are like us because, I mean, he has a more metaphysical element to it. But in our use of social media and in our use of sort of conferring prizes on other people, or even in denying them these prizes by not liking something or downvoting things or whatever, are we just sort of inundated with these shadows, right? With things that are essentially, superfluous, superficial, indeed harmful, right? Because Plato's going to say that kind of stuff, if you're completely absorbed and engaged in this shadow world, as it were, it's going to be harmful. So one thing that Facebook actually does engage in is, of course, targeted advertising, right? Again, I've mentioned, if you go to Meijer and you're looking at coffee pots, you go home and you log into Facebook, you're going to see advertisements for coffee pots. That's both Facebook and Meijer sort of in collaboration, right? But the advertising itself, based on what the algorithm picks up and what it thinks you like, you're just going to get more of that same, right? It doesn't interpret it as being quote unquote good, but that's kind of the label that it's giving to the content that you're, looking at or whatever, just because that's what it has to do, right? It has to understand engagement as a good. And again, this kind of thing happens across all platforms. So what the algorithm is essentially doing is taking your preferences and labeling them good because of, or in relation to the engagement that they generate. It's really kind of interesting, though, because there are some sites, for example, Twitter, and that don't use this kind of algorithm, it's just, slop. Your what is it, the timeline or whatever it's called on Twitter. It's just whatever shows up, right? With Facebook, they're trying to make what shows up a little bit more limited and personalized, based on how the algorithm understands you. So obviously the question is, does the algorithm really know what it's good for you? And of course, the answer probably right now is no. The algorithm we can think of as perhaps a piece of artificial intelligence. Is it possible, going back to some earlier themes, is it possible for that kind of thing, that kind of technology, to know what good is, right? Or is it, again, just kind of mimicking it? The interpretation of good that Facebook has is just what the algorithm sort of spits out. Perhaps a more advanced algorithm would be, something else entirely, going back to the Turing test issue. Other things, at what point are we relying on this algorithm to essentially tell us what we think is best for us? Maybe you're sort of indecisive about things, and what you do, just out of sheer laziness or something, you just scroll through Facebook or wherever, and you would kind of accept what's presented to you, right? I think that happens. I mean, one thing that Facebook is doing, especially with the sort of sponsored retail content, it's relying on the fact that people impulse buy a lot. So what does this sort of thing say about our control over our self-identity through social media, right? People sometimes express their identity through the things that they buy, right? The clothes that they wear, the cars that they drive, the music that they listen to, et cetera, et cetera. But if this is targeted through this weird algorithm, is it in some sense shaping your self-identity, right? And how much control do you have over that? I think that's a pretty kind of serious question, especially in light of some of this stuff, this insider stuff that's coming out about Facebook recently. I actually watched some of that. The whistleblower, she was in England, I believe, last Monday. I watched some of that. It's pretty scary, actually. All right, so that's kind of the platonic element. Again, some of these issues we're going to kind of come back to every once in a while. Are there any questions before we get to the actual sort of larger article by Valkenberg and Poitrowski?
Questions
Jason,
about...
I have a question while you're soliciting other questions.
Yeah.
I just wanted some clarification on the brick and mortar to social media algorithm thing that you did with Meyer and Facebook. It seems like there are instances where, if you use your credit card and your credit card's company sells your information, or you put in a rewards number, that could be true. It's not clear that that's just like, or even if you have access allowed on your microphone at all times, it doesn't seem like Facebook can get that information.
Actually, I don't know about the technology, but I do know that if you are signed up for certain things, and again, I don't exactly know, if you are signed up for certain things and certain privacy settings on Facebook, and if you're signed up for, say, Meyer rewards or whatever, they are connected in some sense, because there's just been instances, say, I think my dad experiences this. He'll go to Meyer, he'll be browsing down an aisle, he'll go onto Facebook, and he'll see, advertisements for Band-Aids or something like that. But yeah, I think you're right that there's not a necessary connection. And I do think that you have to sign up for various things. But I think that some people don't realize that when they are signing up for those things, that it's going to track, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
We have a question from Blake. Is the algorithm a form of confirmation bias?
Interesting. Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to explore, actually. It could be, in a way, it could be, because I think that it's obviously spitting back information that it's gathering from your own preferences. So yeah, in that sense, it is. The weird thing about the algorithm is that it's so complicated and so deep, like these days, at least. It didn't start out that way, I don't think, like in 2007 when it was introduced or whenever it was. But it's pretty deep right now. And apparently it's also pretty accurate about certain things. It's very accurate about predicting your behaviors and knowing certain things about you that maybe you don't even know. And that's kind of scary. But I think the interesting question is, does it know this stuff about a you before you actually could use it, or is it sort of creating a you that it knows about? So that, I mean, these are really sort of weird chicken and egg kind of questions, but yeah, I think that is part of this.
Another resource, if you're interested in algorithmic bias, are a couple of books, which I'll go ahead and put those in the chat. Ones that caught my eye were first, Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism by Safiya Noble, and Weapons of Math Destruction.
Yes.
I promise I didn't develop a lisp of math destruction by Kathy O'Neill. And I'll go ahead and put those titles and authors if you are interested in the Zoom chat.
Yeah, that's good. Was the Noble one a study of Google?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, yeah. And the Weapons of Math Destruction, I think I have that. That's pretty good too. So that's going into some detail.
Absolutely.
Good, yeah. All right, so Valkenberg and Poitrowski are talking about, for the most part, what they're talking about is how young people use social media. And again, this article, I think, is, almost 10 years old or so. It's from a book. But there, obviously, some of these issues still apply, but keep in mind, of course, that their study, and pretty much any study from, say, 10 years ago or so, that does the internet, it's going to be outdated, when it prints, just because of the speed with which all of this kind of changes. But some of this stuff is obviously still pretty relevant. So a central question here is, what happens when internet technology, the good old 1990s internet technology that we all know and love, if you're old, what happens when that is combined with a sort of super convenient delivery system? Well, this is the kind of thing that happened, obviously, in about 2006. Not only was the internet technology itself changing, or had already changed. So, for example, you're moving away from things like AOL Instant Messenger or AOL chat rooms or any sort of chat rooms or blogs or whatever. You're moving from that kind of thing to social media itself. In 2005, basically what you had to do is go to your laptop or your desktop, type in your password, press the button, and you're on Facebook. What happened in 2006, as we all know, or right around there, Apple came out with a smartphone, or that smartphone kind of technology. And that changed everything. It wasn't at that time connected to social media in any strong sense, but obviously the potential was there. So smartphones are the sort of physical technology that we're talking about here. And we can think of them as sort of enhancing the all-purpose nature of the internet by increasing certain elements of the internet, right? Number one, it's ubiquity, right? Again, there used to be a time when if you wanted to log on to Facebook, you had to kind of physically get out your computer or go to your desktop and log in, and then spend, 10 hours on Facebook, as some people apparently did. Now, however, with the technology, it's basically everywhere, right? It's ubiquitous. It's also socially entrenched, right? Every part of society you can think, or lots of different parts of society, are now connected through social media websites. Just some of the issues about retail that we were talking about. You drive down the street, for example, and you drive past a church. What does it say on their little blinking sign? Follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. Churches have Facebook accounts now. And finally, it sort of increases this power that it has over us. In that sense, what we mean is it's kind of difficult not to use it. It's difficult not to have a smartphone with internet, social media technology already on it if you want to get by in today's world, right? Even just to log on to D2L, you need a smartphone or something similar. At least I do. It's really annoying. But they become really, a major part of how we function as a society. So they do have this power over us, and part of that, of course, is going to be political power, or at least our political engagement. Does it have to be that way? Of course not. But you start rolling a ball down a hill, it's kind of difficult to stop it. So one question then is, how much of this ubiquity, right, the fact that it's everywhere, how much of that, the ubiquity, the social entrenchment and power over us, how much of this is technologically determined through the smartphone technology? You can think of this in a couple of different ways, right? So once a social media platform becomes entrenched through this technology, right, because we have it in our hands, if you were to destroy that social media site, for example, would it regrow like a hydra, right? One of these, ancient Greek monsters, right? So what I have in mind here is something like in the last few years, 8chan, for example, was a major spreader of sort of political disinformation and just sewage, internet sewage. What happens when you get rid of that? Well, does it come back even stronger in other ways? Deplatformed people, can they or do they find or develop other media sites, right? To use the field of dreams metaphor, if you destroy it, will it come back and sort of rebuild itself? So what you get now, in fact, is, I believe in the last week or so, Donald Trump has announced that he is creating his own social media site, largely because he was, kicked off Twitter or whatever it was back in January. And his is the only one, right? There's a few different ones who are trying to be sort of alternatives to things like Twitter and Facebook. Now, what's interesting about that, and we're going to see this when we read a chapter from Talia Laban's book, is that kind of, if you want to do that to sort of spread political, propaganda or something like that, it's not going to work, right? And so one question is, what happens to these, deplatformed social media sites that try to rebuild somewhere else? How does that work in this kind of political environment? I think that that's a really interesting question that we're going to get to a little bit later. All right. But the question here, or the question on this slide, is if you destroy some sort of social media element, can it or will it come back stronger in another form? All right, 3 features of smartphone technology that are pretty obvious, obviously. Portability, you have it in your hand. You're probably looking at it right now. Power and connectedness, right? We can connect very, very easily through our smartphones, as we've seen with Turkle. Perhaps ironically, one of the ways that we least use our smartphones to connect is by using it as a phone. Are there unintended consequences of some of these issues? For example, just kind of going back to some of these tenor type questions, right? Online retail convenience creates job losses in other areas, right? So I don't know if this is really a tenor type issue, but obviously Amazon is ruining lots of businesses, right? The most obvious one, or the one that's been in the news, is independent bookstores. Independent bookstores, or even large chains. What was the one that Borders Books, I believe, that folded a few years ago? It couldn't really compete with Amazon. And what Amazon is also doing is sort of taking some independent booksellers under their wing and allowing them to sell on Amazon. And I don't think that it's really helping those people, but this juggernaut of a company is creating job losses in other areas. Loss of alone time, right? Does loss of alone time create sort of a desire for more online connectivity? So, and you can even think of that as sort of a vicious cycle in a way, right? The more we go online, the less we're out in public with other actual people. And maybe that makes us feel more alone, as it were. And so we go back online to have more connectivity, and you just get deeper and deeper and deeper into it. So we also have these kind of Turkle type questions here. Is more online connectivity creating this different type of alone time, right? A sort of inauthentic connectivity, right? Is this a new type of loneliness even? So in other words, the more physical isolation that we feel, we turn to the internet to get connectivity. But is that kind of connectivity, in Turkle's kind of parlance, inauthentic or superficial, that sort of thing? That's another kind of vicious cycle kind of question. I think it's a pretty important one too. Now, you can also think that our entrenchment in social media doesn't actually afford us an ability to consciously sort of keep up with this changing technology. Just the old joke with Apple computers, right? In fact, I read somebody I follow on Twitter posted this just this morning. It was something like, in December 2020, I bought one of these brand new MacBook Pros. Literally a day later, they came out with something even more powerful. They're doing this all the time. But the joke with Apple is, it becomes obsolete and you can't like update it. So you have to buy an entirely new product. I don't know how true this is, but that's kind of been the joke with Apple. But also just cognitively speaking, right? Can we cognitively keep up with just how rapidly this kind of change in technology is taking place? Facebook admittedly hasn't really done a whole lot of new interesting things for the last several years. And I believe that they're worried about that. And that's why they keep, pushing this engagement thing so that they can stay relevant. Again, financially, you have to buy a new smartphone every few years if you want to actually, be in the world. All right, so this is kind of an overview of what they're talking about. Just let's now kind of move to some interesting specific, concepts that Valkenberg and Poitrowski are discussing here. So one is this issue or this idea of affordances. I believe in the previous set of articles that we read last week, the guy uses the term affordances. So it is an issue in social media studies. What exactly is this? Well, you can think of an affordance as sort of the possibility that something in our environment offers us. That's a very general kind of understanding of what we mean here. What possibilities does anything that you find in your environment offer you that perhaps it wasn't meant to? So we have this distinction between different kinds of affordances. Excuse me. Some of them are intentional, obviously. An example of an intentional affordance would be you build a chair to sit in, right? That's what it's designed for. Some affordances, though, are unintended. So what is an unintended affordance? Think of these as possibilities for objects observed or selected by the users themselves, but not necessarily intended by the designer. So real world sort of examples, you can use a table as a desk, for example. Common scene in like a movie or whatever. Mom is going back to school. She's going back to night school to become a lawyer. What does she do? She sprawls all her books out on the kitchen table, right? She's treating that table as a desk. Another common example would be sunken ships, right? You're using actual sunken ships to create reefs. And then they are offered, they're used in that way to sort of, bring back life. Biodiversity, that kind of thing. You can use a baby doll, an abandoned baby doll as a nest. What? And that's kind of a creepy picture, right? But these bees or hornets or whatever it is, they decided to take this baby doll and live there. You also get this kind of idea in social media, though. And what's interesting is that some of the most well-known things that we love about social media are actually unintended affordances. The biggest one is probably the Twitter hashtag. I believe that the Twitter hashtag was something that one, highly intelligent, computer savvy user started. And I don't know the technology, how they do this kind of stuff, but a user themselves created the idea of the hashtag, and then eventually Twitter sort of, incorporated it into its own technology. And so now, of course, you can use a hashtag. What do? You do the pound sign, you write something out. Oftentimes they're already there, so you can choose one, but you don't have to. And that takes you to everybody that's talking about that particular topic. Facebook algorithm is also has been used as a sort of unintended affordance. Advertising loopholes. In fact, what's interesting is that I believe, somebody can quote me if I'm getting this wrong, of course, but I believe that in the 2008, maybe the 2012 election, it's one of those, the Obama campaign very cleverly used Facebook advertising elements to sort of target, likely voters, that kind of thing. And then I think in the 2016 campaign, the Trump campaign kind of took that and, put it on steroids a little bit. But what's interesting is that, and of course, we all know the stories of, foreign interference and foreign entities sort of exploiting Facebook's algorithm and their advertising loopholes to sort of, target people in ways that they want to. So what's interesting is that, of course, Mark Zuckerberg didn't create this kind of stuff to say, what would be really great is if the Russian government exploited this algorithm to disrupt American society. That would be great, everybody. He didn't do that, right? This is an unintended affordance, something that a user found that they could sort of use differently from how the product was designed or the reason that it was designed for. But these things exist, right? They're happening right now. And what's interesting is that this guy here, Roger McNamee, I believe, used to work for Facebook. He was, in fact, a sort of mentor or guru or whatever you want to call him to Mark Zuckerberg. And he wrote a book. It's a nice play on words. The book, I believe, is called Zucked, right? We're zucked. But here's a couple of quotes from this book. You don't have to write these down, but it's pretty interesting, this kind of internal story here. He says, finally, I reached out to Mark and Sheryl Sandberg, who I don't know her title, but she's kind of in the thick of all of this. I reached out to Mark and Sheryl with an opinion piece I'd written in which I suggested that there was a systemic problem with the algorithms and the business model that was allowing bad actors to harm innocent people. And it's interesting because in what sense are these bad actors harming innocent people, but by allowing these innocent people to, in a sense, harm themselves through engagement? They very politely replied to me, but suggested that in their view, what I'd seen was isolated and that they had taken care of it. And in fact, that's Mark Zuckerberg's response to all of this stuff. Political, factions, fragmentation, isolation, echo chambers, all that. Yeah, we've taken care of that, or we're working on it, right? That's always kind of the response. And that's exactly what this sort of insider was getting from them as well. So he continues, that's when I decided I'd better figure out exactly what happened. I met Tristan Harris, a design ethicist from Google. I think he's the one that has the movie out, isn't he? The Social Dilemma. I think that's him.
Yeah.
Who talked about what he called brain hacking, a term that he invented to describe, this is my emphasis, the persuasive technologies used by internet platforms that enable them to develop habits in the minds of the people who use the products. Those habits evolve into addictions. And that situation makes users vulnerable to manipulation, right? And I'm not quite sure when this interview with McNamee was. His book came out, I think, a couple of years ago or so. But what's really fascinating is that even on Monday at the trials that this whistleblower was, she was a witness in England, she said the exact same thing, right? Internal Facebook studies and data and bickering and all that shows that the technology itself is a lot like a drug, right? You become addicted to it. And just like with any addiction, it's difficult to get out of it, right? But there have been not just internal Facebook studies that show this, but actual studies that show that social media use operates on the brain cognitively a lot like an addictive drug. So that's, of course, going to be an issue when we talk about vulnerability to manipulation, right? So I think that's a really kind of damning indictment, I think, about Facebook. All right. Now our authors kind of lay out a whole bunch of different kinds of affordances that they think are important when it comes to social media. The first one is asynchronicity, right? This is a buzzword that we perhaps were not familiar with a couple of years ago, but we all are now because of the pandemic. The idea here is that with asynchronicity, you can communicate when you want to, right? That's one of the affordances of social media. If you want to understand it through the, online education, it was basically the professor puts up a video and you can watch it when you want. There's no like live class. So it's the same kind of thing. But with smartphone technology, especially, this is, I think, important to emphasize, simply because obviously you've got your phone, somebody texts you, you may not want to talk to them at that moment. You're in the middle of something, whatever. Another one is identifiability. Anonymity versus your true identity. Again, this is one of those issues that we've been talking about. Mainly, how does the technology itself shape our identity? In the course pack reading Acting for Facebook, the author does make that distinction between a real me and the sort of, put on, right? It's a put on Facebook in a similar way that it's a put on when you're on stage, for example. So that author, he's basically sort of analyzing social media presentation through the lens of what actors do. That was kind of interesting. Cue manageability. This idea is that you can show or hide visual or auditory clues, right? You ostensibly have control over this. It's your information. You choose how the world sees you, right? It's like a J.G. Wentworth commercial. Accessibility, find information and other people, right? Whether they, did my camera just go out?
Yes.
Okay, hold on a second.
Yep.
Etc. Video.
There we go.
Great. It'll probably do it again. Yeah, accessibility. Find information and other people, right? Depending on how people set their privacy settings, you have certain access to them. Scalability, choose the size and nature of your audience. Sometimes this is more difficult than at other times, right? If you don't have a large following on Twitter, you can't really choose the size of your audience, but who you follow, that's up to you. Part of this is done through queue manageability, right? The more you put yourself out there, I guess the idea is that the more obviously you're going to be visible, but if there's nobody watching, then it's kind of pointless. Replicability, copy or share your content. Retrievability, store and retrieve your content. So these are just a bunch of, I guess you can say, settings or elements of social media that that they consider to be affordances, right? These are the sorts of things that social media allows you to do. It affords you this ability. Now, when we're talking about things like identity exploration or creation through these affordances, there's a few different ways that they're important, right? Authors talk about one thing, self-presentation, presenting aspects of your identity within some sort of normative standard of a certain audience. So this goes back to some of the ideas that we've talked about earlier, right? Different audiences might have different norms that you follow when you're sort of presenting certain aspects of your identity to that particular audience, right? So say again, you're at the Thanksgiving table. Perhaps you're not going to wear your leather coat and have a mohawk, right? When you're sitting next to Aunt Millie or whatever. But when Thanksgiving is over, you put your leather jacket on, you put your hair up, you go out to the club or the show or whatever. It's a different set of norms. So in this sense, you are, right, i.e. how you present yourself, you are in accordance with the norms of different groups. Going back to the acting for Facebook thing, you can see this kind of thing working. Obviously, you're playing a different character depending on what play you're in or what TV show or movie. Secondly, the issue of self-disclosure. Sharing intimate information according to the normative standards of a certain audience. Obviously, these are related. So the issue here is how might self-presentation and self-disclosure affect or influence our perceived identity, right? How we identify or understand ourselves, right? Which self are we presenting or disclosing? Does a new self emerge through the very use of this social media technology? Now, this is one of those issues that we talked about a little bit a few weeks ago or so, the idea of fragmentation, right? A fragmented self. So if you are presenting yourself in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different forums, social media, apps or whatever, does this or can this lead to a sense of fragmentation of yourself? And what does that do to you? What psychological impact might that have? So I think that's an important question, I think, when we get to how we're acting in the world politically, right? What kind of person are we acting in the political world? Now, as I've mentioned a few times, this does, I think, cut across generational lines, right? So if you take the older generation, self-presentation and disclosure. These are usually realized offline, right? So just because they didn't grow up with or through or under the, under the umbrella of this social media technology, they're just not used to it, or they're at least comfortable, I think, with a version of themselves that they've already created outside of being online. The younger generation, though, as I've mentioned, these two issues, and Turkle discusses this as well, they're sort of they're realized in the use of social media and online activity itself, right? And in fact, the younger generation seems to prefer this, right? They just don't know another way, in a way. Social media helps them feel more connected with their friends' feelings and daily lives, right? So this is not unrelated to some of the stuff that Turkle was talking about, especially in her second article, where she's interviewing all those students and, talking about their social media practices. Now, of course, also, related to older generation versus younger generation is something we've discussed a little bit before, the issue of privacy. Is social media kind of changing our understanding of privacy, how important it is, how it works, and whether we care or not, right? But the affordance here is of, it's supposed to be of enhanced control over our information. Now, the authors make this distinction between informational privacy on the one hand. You can think of this as the extent to which you control your personal information. Talking about something like Facebook, as I've mentioned, this can be pretty convoluted. Their privacy settings are, in a sense, pretty difficult to maintain. Versus psychological privacy, right? The possibility to control what, when, and to whom you share your information. Now, the big question, I think, with the issue of privacy is, well, there's a lot of different questions, actually. One of them is just the question I just mentioned, which is, do people care? Do people care as much now about their privacy than they would have, say, 30 years ago? Again, generations, right? Take somebody 30 years ago who has not grown up with social media. They understand the issue of privacy perhaps a little bit differently from somebody who has grown up within the context of the ubiquity of social media. It's just everywhere and you can't escape it. You might as well deal with it. You might as well live with it. You might as well, in a sense, mold your life to it, right? And I think that that's what some people have actually been doing. Other questions, though, are things like, does psychological privacy basically give us nothing but an illusion of control? Does Facebook's privacy settings actually only give us an illusion of control, on top of some pretty obvious control settings? But at the deeper level, I think we talked about this last week, there's just some things in terms of privacy that we cannot control. So is it just an illusion? More interestingly, I think, is such an illusion actually required for the success of any social media platform? In other words, they have to make you think that you're in control of your privacy, but you can't be completely in control of your privacy, right? Because then, frankly, what's the point of being on social media, right? If you go and sign up for Facebook or whatever, and it allows you to shut everybody out and just have a profile for yourself, there's nothing social about that. So at least there's some sort of an illusion that you can control it, but you can't control everything. And the point would be, it would be pointless to use social media if you could. So what about this lure of social media, right? What are the trade-offs? involved in relinquishing some of our privacy that we otherwise might not, right? Well, a couple of ideas here. You can trade your sense of self for social media's conveniences. Again, part of this is going to be realized in the retail sphere, right? Meijer knows what you're doing. Amazon knows what you're doing. Amazon knows what you're thinking. Amazon wants to recommend you a book, et cetera, et cetera. And somehow, perhaps that's going to change how you view yourself. Maybe I really do like romantic comedies or whatever. All right. I mean, Facebook says frequently they, give me things like, recommended just for you. And it'll be like, a doll or something. It's like, what did I click on to like have them think that this is what I wanted? Secondly, acknowledge but actually accept that social media uses your information against you in some ways. And I think that this is what's happening. For a lot of people, they just don't care, right? So through algorithmic manipulation, of which we are unaware. You can't be aware of the depths of Facebook's algorithms, but do you really care to be aware of it? And finally, are there perceived benefits versus real harms? And how exactly, if you want to be a social media user, how do you weigh those out? Or even can you weigh those out in any intelligent way if Facebook or whatever is already manipulating you? Now, a lot of these ideas get us to this next concept, which I think is pretty interesting. This idea of expression effects. Now, this is something that we've sort of hinted at a little bit last few sessions. But the idea is this: when a sender of content internalizes the behavior that they show or beliefs that they disclose, such that their self-concept or behavior in fact changes to be more in line with what they share, than with who they are, in quote unquote, in real life, right? So in other words, the idea here is that you're sharing things online and you start to identify with the things that you share online, and internalize that into quote unquote your in real life self, right? So you've become the media influencer, as it were, that you present online. Now, this is kind of you can think of this as a two-way street, right? As consumers of content and producers of content. Because the unique thing, again, about social media is that we're both, right? I consume, you can consume things, the images on Instagram, for example, but that might influence you in some sense to create your own content that's similar. So the idea here is, or the question is, the more we share, the more we actually end up changing to fit this online identity that we're actively creating. So I mentioned last time this, I don't know, influencer or whatever, who found herself becoming more like this character that she was presenting on Instagram. And it kind of scared her a bit. So she pulled back. I think she stopped doing influencing. So here's a quote: over time, the taking, retaking, and posting of selfies, for example, which is a social media behavior, may influence not only the recipients of these selfies, right? Oh boy, that person's really having fun, or my friend is always happy, that kind of thing. But also the selfie taker's self-perception, right? The more you put out content, selfies or whatever, the more you sort of identify with that person, right? So again, it has influence in a number of different places, right? It's influencing the people who see the selfie, but it's also influencing you the more you sort of engage in this kind of activity. So that's the idea of expression effects. The effects that we have are the effects that exist from our expressing ourselves through online technology. And as always, we can go back to Plato, as I like to do. So Plato asks, how is it possible to tell the difference between what is real and what is an illusion, right? I think most of our authors believe that there is that distinction, right? Is there a real self distinguishable from this online identity? So the acting for Facebook article, I think Bronner assumes that the answer is yes, right? So he is saying, look, there has to be a little bit of pushback to all of this online identity creation, right? Sometimes you have to step back and say, where am I? Where's the real me? You know, going back to that article from last week, preserve the backstage, as it were, for this place where you can, quote unquote, you know, let your hair down or be the real you. So I think that that concept is something that most of our authors are going to accept. The big question is then, if there is this difference between the in real life me and the online me, how do you tell the difference? And again, just the concept of expression effects over time, is there in fact a difference, right? Going back to our cat metaphor that we've been playing with, there's the cat. Perhaps the online image is this platonic shadow of a lion, right? This is how the cat sees themselves. Then again, the expression effects issue here is, does the cat start to take on more qualities of the lion the more they engage in that identity creation? By the way, the cat is you and me, right? I just like cats.
Relatable.
So yeah, what?
I just like relatable. I like cats too.
Yeah, right, exactly. This is some relatable content here, folks. And you know, we can also wait, where did that go? Oh, okay. I skipped a slide, but we'll find out. Wait, did I? Yeah. Okay, great. I'm missing a slide, but it doesn't really matter. Another question is cognitive effects. The authors talk about how is social media engagement and use sort of affecting our abilities to think, right? Are we less able to concentrate now than we used to be because of social media? I remember a couple of years ago or so, in philosophy 101 or whatever it was, a student says, hey, I think this stuff is really interesting. Can you point me to some other sources or whatever, so I can, read more about this topic or whatever it was. And I said, yeah, just go to the library and, look up, keyword search, and then all these books will come up. And the student literally said, oh, I can't do that. I can't read books. I mean, the student, I think, had an eye condition or something, but they were much more comfortable reading, through their iPad or whatever. And perhaps it was just that they couldn't concentrate with an actual book, right? Who has time to read a book, right? Secondly, are we unable to remember things, right? I find it difficult to remember, let's say, my cell phone number, but of course I know the phone number that I had when I was 3, right? That kind of thing. What cognitive effects is it having, in other words? You might be able to counter this, though, and I think a technologist, a techno-optimist would want to counter this. We don't need to remember things anymore. We don't need to remember stupid things like our cell phone numbers, because it's all in the technology there. We don't need to remember multiplication tables. You can just on your smartphone, right? This is good, according to the techno-optimist, because it's freeing up room for us to remember the important things. So you can kind of maybe ask even a sort of tenor-esque kind of question, right? Might this not lead to examples of something like repeating effects? Technologies that free up space actually create more clutter. What's really interesting, though, if we're thinking about this cognitively, look at this question, right? Or this issue. This frees up room for us to remember the important things, because now we don't have to remember the superficial, trivial things like phone numbers. But if this is in fact having a sort of dramatic effect on our cognition, this freeing up room for us to remember important things, who cares about quote unquote important or deep things anymore, right? Is the technology use in fact making us more superficial as well, right? Because if you want to have deep engagement, going back to Alex Winter or John Hodgman, you're not going to get it on Twitter. You're going to have to actually sit down with somebody and have a long form conversation probably. You're not going to get it in the Facebook comments, etc. But do people care about that anymore? Or is it all just this soundbite stuff? So I think that's a really interesting question. And I wonder how much cognitive scientists and psychologists are actually looking at that. So just to kind of sum up the issue of expression effects, the idea here is that the more we share, the more we change to fit this online identity that we're actively creating. Is an expression effects, again, sort of an identity feedback loop, right? The breaking apart of the cat and the lion, nevertheless, does this sort of feedback into, do these feedback into each other, right? The in real life you becomes more like the online version and vice versa. This idea of the feedback loop is something we talked about last week. I do want to emphasize, though, that this form of identity creation is not always going to be negative. So again, if we can't make the distinction between the real life you and the online you, maybe that's not a bad thing. It depends, I think, on how we understand what the technology is doing to us. And I think that's kind of the big open question right now.